Morning. Actually, one of the things that I was doing yesterday is asking what do you expect me to say. And I was a little bit disappointed when quite a few of the responses were, well, say what you usually do. Say what you usually say, which is kind of quite low expectations. Because, in fact, the kind of things that I say are the kinds of things that you say, and we've been hearing all week. And although interesting and useful, they're not worthy of the conclusion of a conference such as this one, in which so many people came from so far with such extraordinary expectations. I think something else is to be expected of this. And so I did prepare a talk, and I did prepare a talk specifically for this morning that fills in the chinks. Perhaps some techniques that were not addressed. But that will be for the next time I'm invited, for the next conference. Because what is necessary to do today is something at a somewhat higher level, which is to pull it all together and project it to the world. And what I would like to do is to set it up, to begin introducing what the process might be like so that Paul Moraine, who in fact is delegated to work on this, perhaps has an easier time, or at least you are more orderly and coincident in your behavior. Now, what is going to make the task, this morning's task, Paul's task, our task actually, easy, and what is going to make it difficult? Surprisingly, what I think will help make it easy is that we have elided, we have actually minimized so many distinctions. I think that people spoke and gave their concerns, and we ourselves did a translation to our circumstance. There was very little of saying, well, this is the way we do it here, now let me translate it for you there. The first of the translations were, of course, the language translations. And there was one very interesting statement by a Brazilian who said, placemaking doesn't make sense as a term in Portuguese. There's a problem with the term. He didn't get very far, but it was pretty interesting how little problem we have had given our very many languages. The second thing that I think we elided gracefully, as Americans say, the bullets that we dodged that could have gone very badly, is that some of us were speaking from and of the problems of developed countries. Some might say overdeveloped countries, such as North America, such as Scandinavia. Some were speaking clearly of developing countries, which used to be called the poor countries, with entirely different circumstances and entirely different problems. And then there were a few allusions, and perhaps it's too early to tell, which are the hyper-developing countries. And those are China in its way and India in its way. There were a few hints about what is happening in China. There's a German bank, Deutsche Bank, that is coming up with a completely impersonal fund to build 2,000 shopping malls in China. Just so you know, the way you get to shopping malls is by car. Okay? We have an enormous monster arising, a monster that is actually picking up some of the worst and most discarded habits of the developed world. They have that ambition. Now, just a little aside, when it was said that Paul Moraine was an American, he's actually British, but he really is an American. I'm a Cuban that grew up in Spain, and I'm very American. And part of the problem is that so many people who are not American are more American than the Americans. Paul and I are more American than the Americans, and the Chinese want to be more American than the Americans. They don't want to be merely suburbia. They want to be Orange County, California. And those are the consultants they hire. And when you actually send them something, a design that isn't Orange County, California, they said, why did we hire a California architect? Don't you do Orange County? So we have a tremendous problem. And we've actually, I think, successfully avoided making an enormous issue of it. The absence of distinctions that I'm listing now are actually a virtue. There's another one, which is a series of distinctions. There are places, it's extraordinarily different. I've worked quite a lot in the United States and quite a lot in Europe, and they're very, very different places. Very different, extraordinary, in the most interesting possible way. There's some real choice, to live in Europe and to live in the United States and to start a business in Europe and the United States and so forth. And we avoided that. And the other thing that we avoided were the places in Europe that would like to be like America. We've completely avoided what is actually happening in the suburbs of Stockholm, which if you open your eyes, you can see on the drive from the airport, and you can see by asking how many shopping malls are outside of Stockholm, how many shopping malls are outside of Brussels, how many suburban shopping malls. And may not be the American numbers, there may not be 4,000 of them, but they are proportionately, not that different. 6 malls in outside of Brussels is the equivalent of the 60 malls of Southern California. They're not that different, and we have this problem of those who would be like Americans, particularly the Eastern Europeans. We've elided that problem. Another one are the differences between the public sector that we've been speaking about, the private sector that we've minimally alluded to, and whenever we have, they are the shopkeepers, the local this, the local banker, and so forth. The private sector we've spoken of is a private sector with a face, a private sector that is accessible, a private sector that you can bring to the table. What we have not spoken about is the private sector of international finance that has no face and is running entirely on automatic protocols and doesn't have time to even look at the shopping malls they own because they have to invest $6 billion a year. And so they're completely working off a checklist. If it satisfies the checklist, we buy it, we bundle it up by the dozen, and then we dice it into financial instruments and we resell it. I've actually met the CEO of a mall that I took to dinner in one of his malls, and he remarked casually that he had never seen it. He'd never been there. I said, but you own this damn $160 million thing. Well, I've never actually seen it. This is the Villaggio in Coral Gables. It's absolutely amazing, this kind of thing. We have not spoken about that impersonal finance, although Chris Leinberger has attempted to bring it up. And this brings up one issue. There were several things that were brought up tentatively and not picked up on. And I think in some ways it was good, because that could be extremely disruptive. But there are some things that we entirely avoided that were actually, I think, explicitly not in the room, and that's not as good. And let me list what they are, okay? What was not in the room, and I mean they were in the room, but they weren't allowed to say how they felt, was the middle class. We're all middle class here. Every place we went to, including that fantastic square, was 100% middle class. Those great wood-paneled floors, the $24 glass of scotch, the couches, the beautiful people, the great shoes, the fantastic international jeans, all that was middle class. And the assumption, at no time was it actually said that we have to actually bring the middle class into the city. But if you remember, Fred Kent, when he showed his work in Chicago, he showed empty streets. Who did he want to bring into Chicago? The middle class. Because Chicago has had it with the poor and unempowered who frankly don't pay taxes. And the only way they can save themselves is by bringing the middle class back in. Okay, so the assumption that we absolutely fear gentrification, the assumption that the middle class will take care of itself, the middle class will take care of itself by moving out to the suburbs and abandoning the city. And about half the problem that we have with the absence of public place is that the middle class is not there to inhabit it and to pay for it and to maintain it, because the middle class has absconded to the suburbs. And I think that the assumption that we absolutely need to empower the poor, you can see in the photographs and the videotape that in most of the countries that we were shown today, placemaking requires the making of space which would be immediately filled by people of enormous energy, starting their own businesses, if you allow them, and actually making the place entirely mixed use, entirely organic, entirely self-regulating. They actually don't need us at all. They need us to get out of the way. And I think there's a lot of professionals here who are experts at getting other people out of the way. That's what they do. They say, let's get the experts out of here because the people know what they're doing. There was a lot of that here. So if I were to reverse some of our concerns, much of the speaking that took place today was actually the proposition, the explication of how people act who are precisely the people who don't need us except to get out of the way. And furthermore, and this is the second thing who was not present, to get the experts out of the way, because the experts are causing a lot of the problems. Now, there are experts and there are experts. There are experts that have been so palpably, idiotically, stupidly wrong. The experts who innovate, the experts who've actually created new towns all over the world and ruined the lives of generations and thrown away the investments of many, many societies. And by the way, no new town of the 50s is exempt, including the famous ones around Stockholm. Now you can say, hey, the others are horrible, but Vällingby isn't that bad, or Milton Keynes actually isn't that bad. It's not that bad compared to what? It's not that bad compared to the other garbage built at the same time, but it's hideously bad compared to the traditional city. And the problem with modernist planning and modernist architecture is that it does not compare itself to what is best, which, by the way, has not disappeared. There are two realities. There are the people who live in the new buildings and the new towns, and there are the people of today who have jobs and are in fact us who live in the traditional cities. And unless we compare ourselves to the best there ever was, we're giving ourselves too much slack. Okay? The really good experts that are not here, so that is a statement of what a bad expert is, the people who have actually created Project for Public Places and the need for this conference, the people who essentially don't know what they're doing because they're continually inventing. And by the way, they need to be avant-garde, because when you point to them the failure of something attempted, they say, oh yes, that failed, but don't look at that, we're not doing that anymore. We've now moved on to this. Now this, of course, we know very well is going to fail, and then they'll say, we are, after all, avant-garde, we will then move off. Don't look at that anymore, we'll move off to the next thing. By the way, in architecture, I think experimentation is acceptable because it only harasses institutions and families. But when you harass a whole society for generations for the sake of experimentation, I do think that planning has to be extraordinarily conservative. Because the risk of getting it wrong has been too high and it is simply too cruel. And what is essentially happening in China is the most extraordinary act of collective cruelty that's been perpetrated on them, and that does not exclude some of the massacres, because the way they're being housed is awful. It's an awful pall that is being cast on Chinese society. But there's another kind of expert, and that expert was not present, and that's the expert who actually knows what they're doing, who really knows what they're doing. And there are two of them here. One of them is Paul Moraine, who actually, if you ask him, if you press a button, says, I damn well know what I'm doing. And you know that that's what he sounds like. And if you ask me, I damn well know what I'm doing. And he gets at it because of very hard empirical research. We're very hard observers of reality, what works, what doesn't. He comes at it from the Hillier space syntax. That's how he begins, and then he moves from there. I come at it from the frontage, how the building meets the ground. You let me code how a building meets the ground, where it meets the ground, how it meets the ground, what's inside that first floor that meets the ground, and I can make and I can make place, and from place the city is implied. That's enough DNA to make a place. You know, and that's actually, in both cases, that's a virtuosic performance. I mean, there are people who know what they're doing and can be exceedingly efficient. They did not have a place here in this conference. There was a lot of questioning, a lot of beginning, a lot of emerging this, emerging that. We need to have them here. And by the way, the people who taught some of us, the Edward T. Halls, the Jan Gels, the Holly Whites, the Oscar Newmans were very precise about what works and what doesn't. How do you make a square that works? How do you make a plaza that works? And by the way, most of the very good places were done before this profession arose. And how they were affected, whether it was Maria Theresia, the most popular ruler that Austria has ever had. I would go and see the best parts of Vienna. The Ringstrasse, by the way, is exceptionally good, all about the projection of power, representing the state, and it works perfectly now. It's a wonderful, unbelievably great places. But there are also other kinds of great places, and I would ask my guide, I said, who did this? Who did that? Maria Theresia, Maria Theresia. I said, do you like Maria Theresia? We adore Maria Theresia. Let me show you her statue. And I said, what was the theory of Maria Theresia? It was everything for the people, nothing through the people. I said, really? Sounds like Robert Moses, you know? And by the way, there's a profession arising right now, very credible, which is in the defense of Robert Moses, which is the exact opposite of what the assumption here today, that it must all be bottom up, bottom up. Not everything will come from bottom up. There's a few things that are necessary that it be bottom up, and some things that are necessary at the middle, and there are a lot of things that need to be top down. And unless we invite the people who don't agree with us, you know, the people who say, yes, there is expertise, there is an efficient way of doing things, there is, in fact, a top-down method that achieves great things as well, we're not going to succeed. We need to invite our opponents into here. The other great opponents that we have are actually the developers. The developers are absolutely expert because for them to fail, and by the way, they create place all the time. Every time they do a shopping mall, with perfect expertise, they fill them. And not only that, but if you ask them to create a plaza, they'll fill it. It'll be spectacularly successful. And if you ask them to come into the city and say, Mr. Developer, here, take over this plaza, fill it with this and that, don't use national tenants, make sure that actually the lower middle class comes in as well as the middle class, they'll do that, and they'll do it efficiently. There are experts. Mostly, there are opponents. They're the people we're competing with because we've driven them to the suburbs. They're not on the table here today. Okay, so there are three people that weren't on the table. The cities that need the middle class, the experts, and those who actually, for the private sector, are competing with the cities we love, hyper-effectively building these outside. The New Urbanists, one of the great differences between this conference and the New Urbanist Conference is that the New Urbanists always invite in their opponents. We want to know what it is that they do, absorb their expertise, and reject that which doesn't happen. Now, speaking of opponents, I think we would be pulled together if we're more explicit about our opponents. There's nothing that unifies a disparate group more if we know who our opponents are. I believe it was hinted that the opponents, and this is, of course, Fred Kent being very kind, the opponents are the ones who make objects instead of places. Objects instead of places. Objects are, what are we talking about here? We're talking about modernist architects who are making sculpture, who actually consider the city to be a work of art. And there are three kinds of people that actually conceive cities differently. There's a great number of powerful people now, including a lot of the politicians, who've been persuaded that the city is a work of art, that you actually brand it with an image, the so-called Bilbao effect. The Bilbao effect and now the High Line are simply the last of the silver bullets of great symbolic one-off solutions that will put the place on the map. One of the earliest was the Space Needle of Seattle. We all need a Space Needle with a rotating restaurant. Well, that didn't work. Well, don't look at that. This is what we do now. The latest is, of course, the High Line. We all need a High Line. These people, in fact, we need to be explicit, our opponents. We need to put it up there and say, this is not what we do. This is what's distorting the issue. This kind of one-off silver bullet, we solve it. We need to know. We also need to know that anybody who's a specialist is our opponent. The people who only care about traffic, the people who only care about affordable housing, the people who only care about any single thing, the people who only care about trees, the people who only care about hydrology. The specialists absolutely dismantle the city. And that's the second conception of the city, which is the city as a repository of statistics. So the first one is the city as artistic manifestation. The second one is the city as repository of statistics. We need to actually, Barcelona has the least number of trees of any city in Europe. So what? It's still great. Why are we counting trees here? Miami has fewer parks than any other city in North America. That's because we have beaches. If you build a park, no one will come. There's all this stuff that actually doesn't work, the statistics, and yet there's a certain kind of planner, always a specialist, who's measuring. And the third are the people who we are, which is the city as the vessel of life. We're the people that actually connect to the humans. And I think what's beautiful about the film and the presentation just now, and about half the presentations today, was continually bringing the humans together, reminding us who it is that we're working for, who it is that we're helping. That's very unusual. It's very, very unusual. Not in our world. In our world, that's what we breathe. But the idea of continually referring to the human is really our thing. If that's our thing, we need to, in some ways, vilify what isn't our thing, because that's how we will define ourselves. So I think our opponents were not explicitly present, and I think we need to bring them here, okay? Now, as we work today, as Paul takes over, we spoke a little bit yesterday about how do we put in order all the things that will come up? How do we put it in order? And Paul made a presentation over and over again that kept speaking about the confusion between macro strategies, meso strategies, and micro strategies. The great connectivities of the social logic of space, the transportation and so forth, all the way down to what the arcade feels like. And there are good arcades and bad arcades. There are arcades that will exterminate commerce and arcades that will enhance commerce, and you better know what you're doing. And there's glass that supports commerce, and glass that actually, and lighting, and all these things, and sidewalk widths, and where you put the cafe tables relative to the sidewalk. All of these things are known, and actually, Paul says, the only confusion is not that they're known, it's just that they're only working at one scale, and we better know what that scale is. I would say that ultimately, in the coming conferences, we need to use that taxonomy, and we need to use a few others, because we have to pull it together technically at some point. The second one is the rural to urban transect. Are we speaking about the center of a big city when we speak of this kind of space, something that's supported with incredible density? Are we speaking of the suburbs of that city? Are we speaking of a village? Are we speaking of the countryside? And I think a lot of that is elided. It's mixed together. We need to know what transect zone we're speaking about. So before the speaker says, I am showing you this city, or I'm showing you this square, what context is it? Is this a big city, a little city, a village? What is it? So the transect, the third one, which is now very much, I think, very promising, is what is called, in the United States, it's enormously promising. It's called tactical urbanism, which is that you try things quickly, you measure, then you implement. In other words, less talk, more experimentation, tactical urbanism. And it's evolving very quickly into a very sophisticated way. By the way, tactical urbanism arose out of new urbanism, and it's going to be the next generation. It's called the next gen. And the latest email that has come in is they're speaking of circumstantial, which is an individual does it with no further end. I am inhabiting this little bit of ground and growing carrots and cabbages in it. That's not tactical urbanism, that's circumstantial. I found a place. Or I'm moving my bench out to watch the girls walk by. And 3 old guys get together on a bench, cute as can be. There are photographs of those. That's circumstantial. Don't confuse that with tactical. Tactical has an intention, ultimately to become permanently, but you experiment. And very importantly, let's not confuse it with strategic. Strategic is basically what we are doing, what the grown-ups should be doing. At some point, it's a little too much to have grown-ups with 35 years experience doing chair bombing. Which is to say, well, here I am, big, highly paid professional, and I'm pulling out 40 chairs from a dumpster, from a container and putting it out, and I'm a planner. And I think we have to remember, let's not sort of make fools of ourselves. There are strategic things to be done. And I think that as we speak in the next conference, there should be a declension that says, this is a tactical action, this is a circumstantial action, this is a strategic action. And I think the last of the taxonomies is governance. There is the assumption, or has been in the assumption in this conference, that actually the neighborhood, curiously, not the individual, but the neighborhood, the community, so-called, gets to decide everything. Well, what happens to the dissenter? What happens to the person that actually doesn't want all this sort of chummy, friendly stuff? What about the person that actually wants it neat? They don't want the grotty. They'd like it to be sort of paved in marble, to make a metaphor of it. Where do they get to actually say, no, I dissent. I think it's actually humiliating to think that chain link is good enough for me. Okay? We have spoken too little about the dissenter. We've also spoken too little about those who need to put through, let me give a clear example, the power lines. The power lines have to go somewhere. Okay? If the neighborhood is going to be asked, we will never get a power line through, which means we will never get renewable energy, which has to be, of course, in a new location, because it's not where the old coal-fired power plant is. We need to put somewhere the solar devices. We need to put somewhere the wind power, the turbines, the windmills, and so forth. And you can't ask the immediate neighbor or the community, because they'll say no. Okay? And I think governance, or what's called subsidiarity, we need to address, and it's terribly difficult, because if not, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that. So I would urge all presentations in the future to tell us at which level to confront who is to make this decision, what kind of context is this based on, et cetera, et cetera. Is this tactical or circumstantial? So we can begin making a taxonomy that puts everything in order. Okay, so now we come to today, and we're to write a document. And this document, there are different ways to write a document. I've actually participated in 3 different kinds. One of them was in Port-au-Prince. In Port-au-Prince, we were doing a charrette for the government for the rebuilding of the capital, and they wouldn't let me start. We were doing this American thing in which we would show solutions, and we'd consult, and they kept asking, what are your premises? What are your premises? And finally, I heard that it was something else. You can't, well, our premises is, no, what are your premises? Before you get into the specific detail, what are your premises? And it was an extraordinary exercise, for example. We had to confront whether the standards for the rebuilding would be essentially seismic construction, earthquake-proof, or simply stuff that would fall down but not kill you. And there's a lot of stuff that cracks and needs to be repaired. And then there's stuff in which the next day, for example, the seismic code of San Francisco, the next day you can get in the elevator, push the button, and it's still perfectly aligned, and you can go up. Now, the expense of seismic-proof construction is simply not possible for Haiti. But it is possible to do construction that when it all shakes, it doesn't actually fall. And it doesn't kill you, and you can go ahead and then call your buddy as A, right? So that is called, and I'm going to give you an example of what it sounds like when you write premises. The second one we did in Cuba and Havana, and that was very interesting because they spoke in terms of rights. They also wanted us to go back. They didn't care about the details. They would trust us with the details because they trust experts. But they wanted to know what the rights were. They spoke in terms of rights. And one of the rights that I remember very well was when they said, we have a right to a nightlife, okay? And that's what I wrote. And if you look at the typed document, it says we have a right to the nightlife. And everybody thinks that's cute as hell. Oh, yeah, the Cubans know what they're doing, all this. Actually, I looked at my notes. When I Googled it in my own files, the notes came up. You know what they actually asked for? They said, we require safety and lighting in the streets at night. That's what they actually said. So what they were saying is, you guys are shutting off the lights because we don't have enough energy to run them, and we want the lights on at night so we can use the streets. The thing about this rights business is that very often it turns out to be a kind of pleading. Like you think you're powerful, but the things you're asking for are so damned obvious that it's kind of saying, can it really have gotten that bad? Are you really so weak that you have to sort of beg for a walkable space? And nevertheless, that connects to people, but there's also another possibility, which is it just turns people off, this business of rights. The third one is one which is an American way of saying things, and it has to do with the very successful Declaration of Independence, which is you make statements not unlike the other two, but in a ringing tone. You basically have, it's not technocratic, it's not rational, it's not cool like the French system. It's actually something that raises your spirits and makes you want to sort of raise the flag and charge something or other. And it has to do with the tone of it. We're all speaking about the same thing, but what's the tone? And that's called a declaration. And we have, if you read the Charter of the New Urbanism, which is an extraordinarily long-lived and successful document, it has that tone. It has the tone of a declaration. And so the way that that would be put, let me just find, to give you 3 examples. Okay, the French system would say, public spaces are to support work and leisure day and night. Cool, rational, comprehensive. The Cuban system of rights, we say, we have a right to the nightlife. You can see the fist, right? And then the American would be, the public space of the city shall belong to all of the people all of the time. You know, which is a different kind of thing. It's more of a slogan. So as we take this on today, by the way, one of the consultations we had yesterday, and one must consult, and we must consult with certain people and not others, the decision was made that it should be in the form of a declaration. And that the United Nations, who is very good at declarations, it's one of the institutions that actually keeps them alive for a very long time until they impose themselves on reality, that a declaration, like the format of a declaration, would be the way to go. And so the proposition is that one, that we get together. Paul is going to lead us through it. I believe Chuck is going to type. And ultimately, it'll be wordsmithed into a declaration. And I believe that now there's a little transition of a group of 3 that will perhaps discuss some of these issues. Thank you.